All right, so I had a clip from a podcast I did over the summer with the boys down at Coach 'em Up podcast, Tim Riley, Zach Zillner. And this post from the other week caught a ton of traction, a lot of feedback, a lot of comments, some good, some not so useful. But essentially, the clip was talking about why are non-contact soft tissue injuries seemingly on an unmitigated rise. And I think that the feedback from the consensus of people was interesting because there are so many different variables that are listed and there's so many different points of view on the subject. And I think it's a really interesting conversation for the most part. But nevertheless, with soft tissue injuries, we have to first recognize that this is a complex multivariant problem. So whether we're talking about professional athletes, we're talking about youth athletics, or even general population, there's a multitude of factors that come into play, and we can split hairs on what the priority or the contribution of these variables may be. And quite frankly, I think it's different depending on who the person is or the context of the situation. But just to name a few that we seem to have some traction with, we have early specialization, we have overuse injuries through an increased exposure through all of these club leagues, AAU leagues. Athletes are just really inundated throughout the entire calendar year. That seems to be one that most people tend to agree upon. The other factors seem to be just increased social stress and emotional stress and blue light exposure and the poor quality of the food that we're all eating and undernourished or underhydrated, and coupling that with chronic fatigue and sympathetic overdrive. We then have our changes in CBAs, our changes in rule structures. I think the NFL is the easiest example of this, where we've seen pretty dramatic changes in the rules and the parameters of the game over the last several years. So that is obviously going to be a factor. And then the big one that everybody likes to ping on is the playing surface. So again, sticking with the NFL, artificial turf versus grass, it seems pretty intuitive to suggest that artificial turf is going to increase injury exposure. But the research on this is actually kind of contraindicating that, but I'll tag on Derek Hansen here because he's done an incredible job of managing and monitoring this over the years. He put some stuff out recently where it was showing that it's basically a 50-50 split. And in fact, there's actually a slightly higher incidence of soft tissue non-contact injuries on grass surfaces versus artificial. So even though we want to buy into that and we want to think that's an intuitive answer, the research doesn't seem to support that at the moment. The other factor that I think is one that's really overlooked with this is the increased velocities of sport. So whether we're talking about the NFL, football, or we're talking about other sports, generally speaking, sports are being played at a higher velocity today than they were 10, 20, 30, certainly 40 years ago. So when we think about the examples and kind of the cherry picking arguments off of this, one of the comments that I saw was like, Michael Jordan used to do bodybuilding and he was as durable as anybody throughout his career. And we can pick and pull all these different people, but these at the end of the day are all N=1 cases, especially when we're talking about elite athletes. So in my mind, the difference between when Jordan was playing in the early mid-90s to the game as it is currently is that the velocity of play is just dramatically higher than it was at that point in time. So with that, we have to understand that the training archetype that was being utilized during that era is really being applied to a different speed of game that we're seeing today. So we transition here now and think about, why do soft tissue injuries occur? Soft tissue injuries, if we boil this list down to a few specific things. Number one, tissues are loaded faster than they're able to respond. It's not necessarily about the force exposure purely as it is the force in the time that it is applied to the body. So the velocity in my mind is the number one thing. The second thing is that tissues are loaded in a direction in which they can't accommodate or tolerate. So the easy example on this is the ACL. When we see a position where the foot is outside of the body, the center of mass the base of support is far out in front of the center of mass, and then we have a degree of angular motion, or we have a cutting action or a deceleration action involved, that is going to expose the ligament to a vector that it cannot accommodate or tolerate. The last factor for primary factors here is going to be either over or under prepared for the demands of the game. And I lump those together, group those two terms together, because I think that they go hand in hand as opposed to being contrasting problems or variables. Overload as we know it to be conventionally is one thing, where we just have somebody who's doing too much repetitive loading of the same exact things without any deviation in their training plans or in their play plans. On the other side, we have underloading, where we see somebody who does nothing over the summer and then they show up for high school camp on August 1st, and as soon as they get going, they pop an Achilles or they pop an ACL. I think that the other aspect of underloading is more where we come into play in our responsibilities or contributions in this, where underloading doesn't mean that we aren't doing enough X, Y, or Z, where it's not just that we're not doing anything or we're not loading the tissue at all. It's that we are doing things that aren't loading the tissues in the proper manner. So we can have an athlete who trains regularly throughout the summer and they do all of these things, but throughout that time, they never actually load or put load on their ACL. They never put load on their shoulder labrum. So in these cases, it's a situation of underload specifically to the tissues. Then we have our extraneous factors, and like I started with, it's an abundance of things. There are so many different factors that come into play. First and foremost, we have injury and training history. The number one predictor of soft tissue injury is having previous soft tissue injury. We have our hormonal profiles, our endocrine profiles, our circulatory dynamics, and our ability to regenerate tissue through our true natural recovery mechanisms. We have surface, we have footwear, we have level of skill, we have all of these different factors. So in my mind, as a strength and conditioning coach, as a practitioner, I want to be aware of these extraneous factors, but I really want to focus in on specifically what I'm able to have influence on or have some level of control over. So what can we do about it? My thing is that we first need to understand thoroughly the sport and the demands of the game and the position that the athlete plays. If we don't understand what our objective outcomes are, then we're really just running in place. The second thing is we need to then understand the specific individual deficits biomechanically, physiologically, etc., with the athlete that we're working with. Take the demands of sport, take the deficits of the athlete, marry those together, and figure out where we need to prioritize our time. The third thing is that we need to completely detach from the extraneous and from the hypothetical conversations. When we're fans of the sport or when we're just talking shop, let's get into the nitty-gritty, let's dive into some of the extraneous factors and see what it may mean. But when we're talking about being pragmatic, we have to really stay focused on these variables that we can control. And as Dan Pfaff has always said, the number one variable of influence for athletes and for the sake of their performance, health, longevity, etc., is the coach that is writing their programming. The fourth thing that I have is that we have to devote ourselves to creating a robust process that fosters integration and resonance. What I mean by that simply is that one person, one treatment, one type of training or restoration is not going to solve the problem, no matter who we're talking about or what the injury may be. If there's anything that I can say definitively that I know, it's that in order to truly have a preventative and a true restorative environment for the sake of soft tissue injuries, it takes a tribal approach. We have to have our nutrition in check. We have to have our sleep in check. We have to have our stress management and emotional management in check. We have to have strength and conditioning. We have to have restorative care and manual therapy. We can't just say that training this way or training that way is going to cure the problem. Doing more of this or less of that is not going to provide a complete solution. So we have to really encourage, no matter what our resources are, what our setting is, we have to encourage the athlete towards a true resonant approach where there are multiple inputs that are unified and dedicated to a singular output. The last thing I wanted to touch on here is that for the strength and conditioning piece specifically, what are the absolute essentials, whether for preventative care or for restorative care for soft tissue injuries? Number one, the tissues have to be loaded. There has to be a force exposure. There's very good evidence on this. There's very good intuitive understanding on this, that if in order to play games at a high rate of speed, that are collision based, that require full exertional outputs, we have to load heavy. Number two, tissues have to be lengthened. So we have to have stretch exposure, and that's not just in the conventional sense of static stretching and we just throw it in at the end of a workout. We have to have movements that are loaded, that put the athlete into a position that puts stretch and length on the tissues. The third thing is that we have to load fast. This is our velocity exposure. So as I mentioned on the factors of the variables for why soft tissue injuries occur, number one for me is the velocity at which the movement is executed or conducted. So in our training, we have to make sure that we are prioritizing doing movements that are loaded, but doing them very fast and at high velocities. Number four, Tissues have to be able to respond. So this is our chaos exposure. And this is probably where I got myself in some shit on that little clip that went on Instagram or whatever. But my point being is that at the end of the day, sport is a microcosm of chaos. So our training, when it's appropriate for the athlete, once we've met those foundational inputs, we then have to look to expose the athletes to variability. And ultimately, for me, the premier athletic attribute is the ability to tolerate variability. So from all of these things that I'm covering in this, we want an athlete to be able to have a wide bandwidth to be able to express the force, the strength, the power that we develop through the more conventional strength. Finally, number 5, tissues have to be regenerated. So this is our restoration or our recovery exposure. Biggest mistake that athletes make with recovery is waiting for an injury to happen or wait until soreness sets in before they decide to go out and do something about it. Think about this as your supportive or your maintenance care, where you are doing soft tissue therapy, you're doing contrast therapy, you're doing grounding, you're doing all of these different modalities and things that we have now in accordance to the high level exertional training, and just staying ahead of getting yourself back to equilibrium a little bit quicker or a little bit better, and then being able to continue to train at a high level. That's the biggest difference. It's not that the restorative stuff is just meant for once an injury has occurred. It's really to potentiate being able to maintain high effort, high exertional, and high velocity training bouts or exposures.